The campfire crackled softly as the group of 5 friends huddled closer, their faces bathed in the warm glow of the flames. The dense forest around them was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Tim, the group's self-proclaimed storyteller, leaned in, his voice low and eerie as he spun a tale of a haunted forest. "Legend says the trees here can speak," he whispered, "but only to those who are truly lost." The others chuckled nervously, stealing glances at the towering pines that seemed to close in on their little campsite. As the night wore on, the laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy quiet. It was then that Dave, who had been staring into the dark woods, furrowed his brow. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, her tone a mix of curiosity and apprehension. It sounded like someone whispering." The group fell silent, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper floated through the air, carried by the wind. "Dave?" The voice was soft, almost tender. Dave's eyes widened in shock. "That's my name," he stammered, backing away from the edge of the firelight. "Who's out there?" The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and the others began to hear their own names being called in the same chilling tone. "Sarah, Tim, Matt, Blair." The voices overlapped, filling the night with a chorus of eerie, disembodied calls. "Stop it," Sarah cried out, covering her ears. "It's just the wind, it has to be." But the whispers persisted, growing frantic, desperate, the last pleas of someone on the verge of death. "Help us. Please. Don't leave us here." Tim's face drained of color. "We need to leave, now." As they scrambled to pack up, the trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching out as if trying to ensnare them. The whispers became shrieks, the voices merging into a cacophony of terror. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." In their panic, they fled into the woods, abandoning their gear. Forest was a maze of shadows, every tree a potential trap. The whispers followed them, relentless, guiding them deeper into the woods. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, and they tumbled into a dark pit. The whispers grew deafening, now just above them, the trees closing in like a vice. "Welcome home." By dawn, the campsite was deserted, fire long since extinguished. Their belongings were strewn about, untouched. Forest stood silent, save for the soft rustling of the pine trees, which now whispered new names, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into their grasp. Tom and Lisa were seasoned campers, always seeking out the most remote and untouched places to set up their tent. That's how they ended up deep in an ancient forest, miles from the nearest trail. As dusk fell, they built a small fire and sat down to enjoy the quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Perfect spot, don't you think?" Tom said, stretching his legs. Lisa nodded, her eyes scanning the darkening woods. "It's almost too quiet." As the night deepened, the firelight cast long shadows, making the trees around them look like looming giants. That's when Tom noticed it. Faint, flickering light, far off in the distance. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing towards the trees. Lisa squinted. "Yeah, it looks like a lantern. But who else would be out here?" Curiosity piqued. They grabbed their flashlights and set off towards the light. As they walked, the flicker became more pronounced, swinging gently as if someone was carrying it. But no matter how far they walked, it couldn't seem to get any closer. "This doesn't make sense," Tom muttered, checking his compass. "We should have reached it by now." Lisa shivered. "Maybe we should go back. This doesn't feel right." Just as they were about to turn back, the lantern abruptly stopped moving. It hung from a low branch, the light steady but dim, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. "Let's take it with us," Tom suggested, reaching for the handle. "No doubt." Lisa grabbed his arm, her voice edged with fear. "We don't know who it belongs to." Tom shrugged her off. "It's just a lantern, Lisa." The moment he touched it, the light extinguished, plunging them into complete darkness. They froze, their breath shallow, ears straining to hear any sound. Then, from behind them came a low, raspy breath. "Tom?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "Was that you?" Tom shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled with his flashlight, but it refused to turn on. The breathing grew louder, closer, surrounding them on all sides. "Run!" Tom hissed, grabbing Lisa's hand. They sprinted back towards their campsite, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, path they had taken now unrecognizable. The breathing followed them, in sync with their frantic footsteps, but no matter how fast they ran, it couldn't escape it. Finally, they burst into their campsite, panting and drenched in sweat. Their fire had gone out, and the tent lay in tatters, as if something had ripped it apart. The lantern was there, hanging from a branch directly above their gear, glowing once again. Tom and Lisa stared at it in horror, realizing that whatever they had brought with them had followed them back. "We need to leave," Lisa whispered, backing away. But as they turned to go, they noticed the shadows around them moving, creeping closer. The breathing was right next to their ears now, bold and relentless. "Tom, I can't move," Lisa gasped, feeling an icy grip around her ankles. The shadows swallowed them whole, and the last thing they saw was the lantern's light flickering, dimming until it finally went out, leaving the forest in silent, suffocating darkness. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the ancient forest, as Sarah and Mike embarked on a midnight hike. They had always loved the thrill of exploring uncharted paths, but tonight, something felt off. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" Sarah asked, glancing back at their camp. It was quickly disappearing into the shadows. Mike grinned, unfazed. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? We'll just go a little way in and head back." They walked for what felt like hours, yet the path seemed endless, winding deeper into the forest with no end in sight. The trees towered above them, their branches intertwining to block out the moonlight, creating a suffocating tunnel of darkness. "Mike, this isn't right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We should have reached the clearing by now." Mike paused, looking around in confusion. "I swear we've been here before." Sarah's breath quickened. "We're going in circles. How is that possible?" Panic set in as they realized the path had become a twisted loop, trapping them in a never-ending maze. Forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the trees creaking and groaning as if they were slowly closing in on them. "We need to stay calm," Mike said, though his voice was shaky. "Let's just retrace our steps." But as they tried to backtrack, forests shifted around them, new paths appearing where none had been before, leading them deeper into the woods. "Mike, look." Sarah pointed to a tree with strange glowing symbols carved into its bark. The symbols pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows on their faces. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, reaching out to touch the symbols. "Don't." Sarah grabbed his hand, her eyes wide with fear. "We don't know what it means." As they stood there, the symbols began to move, the carvings shifting and twisting as if alive. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and suddenly, earth gave way, dragging them down into a pitch-black void. They fell for what seemed like an eternity, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. When they finally hit solid ground, they found themselves in a narrow, suffocating tunnel, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols. "This can't be real," Sarah whispered, a voice echoing in the confined space. Mike's breathing was ragged, his eyes darting around in terror. "We need to get out of here." They crawled through the tunnel, their hands scraping against the rough walls. The symbols seemed to mock them, their glow intensifying with each passing moment. Finally, they emerged into a small, circular clearing, surrounded by the same trees they had been trying to escape. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and covered in moss. On it lay an old, weathered book, its pages open and glowing with the same sickly light. "This has to be some kind of nightmare," Mike said, his voice breaking. Sarah approached the book, drawn to it despite her fear. The pages were filled with incomprehensible symbols, yet she felt compelled to read them. As she did, the forest around them began to change. The trees warping and twisting, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground trembled again, and the symbols on the trees glowed brighter, searing into their minds. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" Mike asked, voice hollow. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with despair. "No, we're trapped." As the symbols burned into their vision, the forest closed in, swallowing them whole. Clearing vanished, and with it, any trace of their existence. The next morning, a new path appeared in the forest, leading unsuspecting hikers deeper into its depth. Those who followed it reported hearing faint cries for help that echoed endlessly, luring them further into the maze. But no one ever found the source of the cries, and those who went too far never returned. Jake had always been fascinated by the woods, spending countless weekends exploring every hidden nook and cranny. So when he stumbled upon a massive, gnarled tree deep in the forest, couldn't resist the urge to investigate. The tree was ancient, bark twisted and cracked with age. A large hollow at its base seemed to beckon him, dark and foreboding. Without thinking, Jake crawled inside, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hollow opened up into a small, cold room carved into the heart of the tree. The air was thick and musty, filled with the scent of decay. Jake's flashlight beam swept over the walls, revealing deep scratch marks etched into the wood, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. In the center of the room lay a dusty old diary, its leather cover cracked and worn. Jake picked it up, its hands trembling as he flipped through the brittle pages. The diary told the story of a man who had become obsessed with the tree, convinced that it held some ancient, dark power. He had spent years searching for it, and when he finally found it, crawled inside, only to discover that the tree was alive, a malevolent force that fed on the souls of those who entered it. The man had tried to escape, but the tree had sealed itself, trapping him inside. As the days passed, he grew weaker, his mind unraveling as the tree whispered to him, filling his head with maddening thoughts. Jake's heart raced as he read the final, desperate entry. "I can hear it. It's coming for me. I can't get out. Please, if anyone finds this, don't let it take you too." Suddenly, the entrance to the hollow slammed shut, the bark closing over it like a mouth, trapping Jake inside. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, clawing at the walls. The wood was solid, unyielding. "Let me out," he screamed, pounding his fists against the walls. "Please, someone help me." The only response was the creaking of the tree as it tightened its grip, walls closing in on him. The air grew thin, suffocating, as the whispers began, soft, insidious, filling his mind with thoughts that weren't his own. "Stay with me," Tree whispered, its voice a cold caress. "I've been so lonely, so hungry." Jake's vision blurred as the air became thinner, his strength fading. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the scratch marks on the wood glowing faintly. His thoughts became muddled, his mind unraveling as the tree's voice filled his head, drowning out all reason. "Please," Jake gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to die here." The tree's grip tightened, the darkness closing in. The last thing Jake saw before he lost consciousness was the diary, lying open on the ground, the final words burning into his mind. "You are mine now." By morning, Tree stood silent and still, its bark smooth and unmarked. There was no sign of Jake, no trace of his frantic struggle. The hollow had vanished, leaving only the faint sound of scratching from within, growing quieter with each passing day. Emily loved the solitude of camping alone, finding peace in the quiet of the woods. She set up her tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, and spent the day exploring the forest, collecting firewood and enjoying the fresh air. As night fell, she settled into her tent, crackling of the campfire lulling her into a sense of security. But just as she was about to drift off to sleep, a sound jolted her awake. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, circling her tent. Her heart pounded as she lay still, listening. Footsteps were slow, methodical, as if someone was walking around her campsite, just beyond the firelight. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then they started again, this time closer, almost brushing against the side of her tent. Fear gripped her as she grabbed her flashlight, unzipping the tent and shining the light into the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that danced in the flickering light. But there was no one there. Emily stepped out of the tent, her flashlight beams sweeping the clearing. The footsteps had stopped, but in the dirt, she could see faint impressions, footprints leading into the trees. She hesitated, every instinct telling her to stay by the fire. Curiosity got the better of her. She followed the footprint, the light from her flashlight barely penetrating the dense darkness of the forest. Footprints led her deeper into the woods, until they abruptly ended at the edge of a steep cliff. Emily stared down at the drop, confusion and fear twisting in her gut. There was no way anyone could have walked here and vanished without a trace. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine. She turned back towards her campsite, only to find it much farther than she had remembered. As she hurried back, the wind picked up, and the trees seemed to whisper her name, their branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching for her. When she finally reached the clearing, her blood ran cold. Her tent was shredded, the fabric hanging in tatters, and her belongings were scattered across the ground. The fire had been extinguished, the ashes cold and dead. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't an animal. Someone had done this. Panic set in as she realized she was completely alone, miles from the nearest trail, with no way to call for help. The footsteps resumed, now just behind her, impossibly close. She spun around, shining her flashlight into the trees. All she saw was darkness. Footsteps circled her, coming closer and closer, until they suddenly stopped, right next to her. "Who's there?" cried out, her voice cracking with fear. Silent. Then a soft, raspy voice whispered in her ear, so close she could feel the cold breath on her neck. "I've been waiting for you." Emily screamed and bolted for the woods, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. Footsteps followed her, matching her pace, never falling behind. No matter how fast she ran, she couldn't shake them. Branches whipped at her face, roots tripped her. She didn't stop. Footsteps were relentless, closing in on her, their rhythm pounding in her ears. Finally, she tripped and fell, her flashlight skittering away. As she scrambled to her feet, she felt a cold hand grip her ankle, pulling her back down. Emily's scream echoed through the woods. There was no one around to hear it. The trees loomed over her, their branches closing in like a cage. The last thing she saw was a shadowy figure, face obscured, leaning over her as the darkness consumed her. By morning, the clearing was empty, the tent and belongings gone. The only sign that Emily had ever been there were the faint, vanishing footprints leading into the woods, disappearing at the edge of a cliff where the trees whispered her name.